Hello and welcome to episode 33 of Match It and the Other Guy. Kevin and I are sitting outside my home on the banks of Lake Wylie. Kevin, how are you doing today?
I'm good. You?
I'm doing very well, thank you very much. Beautiful weather, no humidity, which for me in Charlotte is a wonderful thing.
Can we book this for now and keep it through the summer season?
I think we may have used that line before.
Yeah, probably, but I still feel the same way.
It stands repeating. It stands repeating every week that you've not got high humidity in the summer in Charlotte, that's for sure.
I mean, it's almost breezy enough. A light jacket would be fine right now.
Yeah. I never know what we're going to be talking about when we sit down and have our conversations around the lake, but you do. So, key is all in. What are we talking about?
Well, quite often, I mean, we enjoy talking about it. It's a great topic in general, is entertainment and forms of entertainment and such like that. And one that we haven't really kind of sub hit on is comedians.
Comedians?
Yeah,
okay.
Comedians.
Yeah.
So some favorites and some ones we grew up with and enjoy to this day. And
yes.
All that. So
start us off. Which is your, I mean, we're not going to say an all-time favorite comedian, but one of your favorite comedians, who would it be?
Well, I kind of like think back early on, back in the, this is also, you got to remember, this is the 80s in the U.S.
Yeah.
Was a big boom of comedy.
Okay.
In fact, I mean, you'll even hear some the comedians today talking about back in the day, there was this just boom of comedy clubs opening up everywhere. And it was like the big thing to do in the 80s. Now, granted, I was a teenager, so I wasn't old enough really to go to those. But they started being big stand-up specials on HBO and such like that. So some of the earlier ones back then were, Bobcat Goldthwait, Seinfeld was getting started. Yeah. And you're coming off, there was, of course, the famous ones from the 70s, your Richard Pryor, your Red Fox, and such like that. And even further back, you go back to, who am I thinking of? Don Rickles and Bob Newhart. And people like that.
Sure, yeah.
So kind of my first introduction was, as you're getting a teenager and kind of getting in with friends, and you'd rent tapes, of different comedians. Eddie Murphy was a big one that happened right at, around that Saturday Night Live time.
This is more your descriptions here of stand-up comics, really.
Yes.
Yeah, doing stand-up routine, right?
Yeah, because they evolve into other things, which we can, definitely continue on with. But mostly the ones that, kind of had a routine or started out as stand-up. Obviously, many of them gone on to much bigger things.
Sure.
But so we were kind of, in that time you would also get videotapes, but you'd also get, you'd buy the cassette of them, and listen to the cassette. So it's a totally different world than what you have now, with, YouTube, pull up anything. And then to see one live was kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
And really the first one that I recall us seeing this was probably 88, 89. So I'm in, college age. And this was in Knoxville because I was at the University of Tennessee. But Paula Poundstone, we went and saw her at a small little club. And actually, we were kind of surprised because she was pretty big then, and to be playing such a small room.
Yeah.
But it was very nice and a nice intimate show, and we had a great time.
They're very cool, those stand-up clubs. And when you describe in the 1980s there was this resurgence, if you like, of stand-up venues, that's exactly what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic as well.
Really?
England
I was curious as to if they had the same thing happen.
England was going through the same thing, and I think I'm far from expert on almost everything in life, but I know a little bit about most things, but not an awful lot about anything in particular. But I always think there's a great synergy between the comedy in the United States and the comedy in England. And so what was happening on one side of the Atlantic was being mirrored to a degree on the other side of the Atlantic. And in the 1980s, 1982 is the year that's stuck in my mind. I don't know if it was you could describe it as a resurgence or just a new wave of stand-up comics and the movement was called the alternative comic scene.
Oh, really?
And that's where we've talked about this before, I'm sure, during our podcast, and the comics that formed the comic strip, and then the young ones were all that cast of characters that were around performing in the clubs of London at the time, and have gone on to much bigger and better things.
Yeah, and I knew coming into this topic that Rick Mayall is one of your all-time favorites, and of course he's the young ones. We ought to get if we could get a bonus every time we mention the young ones, we'd be doing very well. But it is something we often come back to. But,
yes. Well, Rick Mayall formed He was very funny in his own right, of course. And for those who are unfamiliar with Rick Mail, gentle listener, and now you've mentioned, we have access to the internet, and that's changed everything. Have a look on YouTube and bring up some Rick Mail or the young ones, and just have a look at Rick Mail's antics. But he formed a very tight-knit partnership with a guy called Adrian Edmondson, who I think had very little exposure actually over in the United States, other than he played Vivian in the young ones.
Yeah, that's the only thing I remember us getting was via MTV, as we've discussed, was that one show.
Yeah, so Adrian Edmondson and Rick Mail together formed this partnership known as, they were Mail and Edmondson, and they've been in a lot of things together. But in the very early days in the 1980s, they were the Dangerous Brothers, and there'd be a lot of really out-of-control slapstick comedy on stage, which really set them apart from most other acts. But a lot of those group of alternative comedians went on to bigger and better things, and now, with the passing years, as is always the case, and you could say the same about a lot of punk artists in the music industry who the establishment would try and dismiss and look down upon and be very unwelcoming to. As the years have progressed, they've now all become national treasures.
Exactly.
Look at John Lydon, Johnny Rotten. At one time, certainly England, most of England despised him and couldn't stand him, but he just kept on and on and on being who he is, and now he's become this sort of cult character, almost like a national treasure that folks love.
Yeah.
It's funny how this happens.
You can't become a legend when you first start. You have to become a legend down the line.
That's right. Yes. And another great, Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie were also around at that time. Of course, Hugh Laurie perhaps most famous for playing House in House.
Yeah, and here we know both. Yeah, it's hard to think of him in anything actually comedic here because we're used to seeing him in dramas. I mean, he was in Stuart Little, which was kind of it was middle of the road. It was funny, but also serious at the same time. But
Hugh Laurie's ability to morph that character into an American doctor is quite incredible because when you hear Hugh Laurie speak naturally, he's got this wonderful clear English accent, Cambridge educated, along with Stephen Fry. And Stephen Fry, again, talking about folks that have become national treasures. And we may have mentioned Stephen Fry on another episode of Match and the Other Guy. Stephen Fry, famous for many things, but in England famous for recording the narration for the Harry Potter books.
Yeah, we mentioned that before.
Yeah, and Stephen Fry has now become this absolute national treasure of radio, and people give him great respect and very well read, and whatever the subject is being discussed, whatever Stephen Fry says, most of the world will agree with. So yes, it's funny how this folks at the time, the young upstart comedians playing in the smallest, dingiest night spots available, anywhere that'll put them on stage to get a break.
Yeah.
And their careers grow and grow and grow.
Well, I think Stephen Fry, I just don't think, can you think of anything that the Americans would associate him with, really? He's still really never broken here with anything. He may not care to, but I can't think of anything that we go, oh, he's the one that's in whatever or went on to do whatever.
I have a feeling...
I know him from some British things, obviously. But.
I have a feeling he may have played Mycroft, Sherlock Holmes' brother, in the Sherlock Holmes movies of fairly recent times. This was Sherlock Holmes. The
Robert Downey Jr. ones?
I have a feeling.
He might have.
I have a feeling.
And I've seen those, but you saw it once in the theater, and that's all I've seen them. So.
And for those unfamiliar with the Sherlock Holmes stories, Sherlock Holmes, absolutely brilliant detective, as we all know and love. But Sherlock was always playing a second fiddle in terms of his intelligence to his infinitely brighter, more intelligent brother, Mycroft, who you are hardly ever heard of in the stories, but he was there in the background. And whenever Sherlock was really struggling to solve something, Mycroft was immediately all over it, and this would be a great annoyance to Sherlock. So that's where. Stephen Fry was absolutely perfect.
He might. Yeah, he might have. I'd have to look back at IMDb or something.
Yes.
Find out.
Yes, but I was very much taken to that alternative comedic scene in England in the 1980s because it was a real breath of fresh air. I think British comedy, and probably to an extent American comedy, had become very safe and set in its ways, and now when you look back on some of the subject matters which comedians thought were amusing back in the 60s and 70s, we would now not consider them to be amusing at all. So there was a definite sense of, we need to be talking about other things. We need to be addressing comedy in a new way.
Yeah.
And I was attracted to that. I thought that was a cool thing.
Yeah, yeah. And I mentioned earlier, I've always loved Don Rickles.
Yeah.
And of course he's passed on now, but he had a very long career, lived quite a good ways. But I tell you, when it was, for years, my latter years, if he was going to be on a nighttime talk show, I either saw it or I recorded it, because I would not miss Rickles on a show, because he was always hilarious to me. He always was steady and good, and a good personality to have on.
Some folks, some comedians in this case, but some folks just have that natural ability to be funny all the time. It's difficult to explain how they do it, isn't it? I mean, in our little world of motor racing, when I was involved in TV, my go-to character would always be David Hobbs. I mean, David Hobbs, as you saw him or heard him on set or on broadcast on the shows, is exactly how he is all the time. Going out to dinner with him in the evenings, it is exactly the same. It wasn't like you were turning a switch. Like some performers are quiet and reserved, if not somewhat slightly depressed, until the lights are on them, and then they become somebody else. They become a character. But David was great on camera, very natural, and is tremendous just away from camera. He's a very natural character. But in that's my experience of one character. But I think some comedians, like you describe, have that, and some don't have that. Some are very reserved.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I always wouldn't miss him. And actually, for a while there, this was probably about 15 years ago. And it was kind of when he was coming up. But Russell Brand, I would always want to catch him on because he's so quick.
Yeah.
I think some people are kind of tired of him a bit, but at the time, he was so quick with his wit and things that he would just keep going during an interview.
Yes.
So I would always kind of try to catch him back then. But of course, he's not doing too many projects these days. But
no, well, it's funny you should say that. I've never been a particularly big fan of his, but we're all aware of his work, and I can't put anybody down for their work and their commitment to their work. Fine, wonderful. But I believe he went through a stage of withdrawal from celebrity because he felt he had become a victim of his own success and wasn't happy.
That's probably a good summation.
Yeah, just wasn't happy about it. And of course, the press, without diverging off what we're talking about, the press, I think in most countries, but certainly the British press, love to encourage celebrities up to a point, and then, like sharks, they're in for the kill and want to destroy the character.
Yeah.
And I can see that being a terrible problem. Not for me, obviously. I've never had that sort of level of success. But I think for celebrities, big, well-known celebrities, I'm sure that can be a constant problem.
Yeah. And, of course, we're talking about, mainly stand-up, but it is amazing to see where some of them have come from. I mean, back in, like I say, when we were in college and watching, these specials and stuff, or you'd rent a videotape, of somebody's stand-up, and that'd be your evening entertainment, or you may watch it 2 or 3 times before you returned it. But, I remember Ellen DeGeneres was just up and coming back then, and she was, one of the, new comedians everybody liked. Look where she is now. So, a lot of them have gone to really completely different things from where they started, and who knew, kind of thing. Of course, this has been getting on 35 years ago.
One of my favorite comedians growing up as a kid in England was a chap called Spike Milligan. Does that name ring a bell?
Doesn't jump out at me at all.
He's no longer with us, but he was wonderfully sharp, astute comedian, and he got his break, as many comedians did of his generation, from working as entertainers to the troops in the Second World War.
Okay.
And when the war, the war in Europe was finished, and the troops were returning home, the BBC were very keen to have variety acts on the BBC, on the radio, and then later on TV. And I suppose it's a natural well to draw from, but the producers of the BBC programs would go to the performers who were entertaining the troops and take those guys. So a lot of them had military backgrounds, and they became very big names. Harry Seacombe was another one, well-known, wonderful singing voice. He's no longer with us. Harry Seacombe and Spike Milligan were part of the Goons, which became a very successful troupe I should say, Monty Python. And so if you ever hear the Goons, to me they're a little bit over the top sometimes. But if you listen to and again, because of the internet, because of YouTube, you can listen to the Goons radio shows. A lot of inspiration for Python was taken from the Goons. So I like to see that sort of progression of humour. But Spike Milligan was wonderfully creative, and he was a poet as well. But sadly to a degree, he was one of those chaps that suffered from a lot of personal insecurity and depression, and he would go through long periods of being very, very unhappy. But again, like we say, when you put the stage lights on him, he becomes a different character. He would become absolutely animated, and it was very surreal for his time. I mean, shows that he was doing back in the late 60s to early 70s were a series of shows. I think they were called like Q4, Q5, Q6. Basically, it was a vehicle to put Spike Milligan on air, and a lot of his sketches, very very like Monty Python sketches, but this is pre Python. A lot of Spike Milligan sketches would run and run and run for, let's say, 3 or 4 minutes, but had no ending. There was no way to end the sketch. And so what they would do, which is something Monty Python picked up on, I'm sure, copied the same thing to a degree, they would just stop and look at the camera, break the fourth wall, as they say, and look at the camera and say, what are we going to do now? 1 step to the left. What are we going to do now? 1 step to the left, until they'd gone off set. And then the next sketch would start, which is something that Python picked up on. The same thing is not having a start, a middle, and a definite end to a sketch. And Monty Python hit this. I mean, they were the masters of the craft. Would roll one sketch into the next one, and one of their wonderful animations would roll into the next sketch they were doing. But nothing ever made sense in a Monty Python show, and nothing ever made sense in a Spike Milligan show. But very similar mindset.
Yeah. Well, speaking of his, personality-wise, it made me think immediately of Robin Williams.
Yes.
Who is that? Obviously he had some very bad.
Yeah.
Personal depression and such, but he was on, and
he was
one of the greats.
Absolutely 100% on. I mean, the bulb was burning overly bright, and then you'd flick the switch and there'd be nothing. What I understand of Robin Williams' life was like that.
Yeah,
it's there was another famous comedian, Tony Hancock, in England, and this is another chap. I don't think he got his break because of entertaining the troops, but he was around that same era. His career started on BBC Radio, and then went on to BBC Television. But his great period of fame was on radio in a show called Hancock's Half Hour. And I'm reminded of him because you just talked about Robin Williams and his depression. And Tony Hancock was exactly the same. He was unbelievably hilarious. He had this wonderful, dry, I'm going to call it like a British sense of humour, that dry sense of humour where you're not quite sure if there's a joke there or not, and then you realise there is. And he was terrific at writing scripts. Very funny. He would always be very self-deprecating, self-effacing, and he would play in his show an unsuccessful comedian always looking for work, and he had a little house in London, and the show revolved around the people that would rent the rooms in his house and the interplay between those people. But off camera, he was exactly that, or off mic, he was exactly the same. I think he went through a lot of depression. But one of probably the most famous Tony Hancock lines, and gentle listener, again, if you are unfamiliar with Tony Hancock or Hancock's Half Hour, go to YouTube because they're all there. His most famous show, as I'm aware of, was a 30-minute show, part of Hancock's Half Hour, called The Blood Donor, which consists of Tony Hancock wanting to do the right thing for self-publicity, to donate blood, and all the antics that revolve around it. And he didn't really realise what giving blood meant. And so he walks into the blood donor's, let's call it a surgery, to sit down, and And the great line is, the nurse says, "Yes, we're just going to put this needle in your arm, and then we're going to take a pint of blood from you." It's a pint. She says, "Yes, a pint of blood. That's what we're going to do." A pint? Do you know how much that is? That's very nearly an armful. Boo-boo. It's a great classic Tony Hancock line, which has lasted for generations. But that's it out there. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to look him up.
Yeah, he's extremely funny, and the cast of characters he had around him were also extremely funny. Sid James was another wonderful comedian that started off with the Carry On movies. I don't know if you ever saw any of the Carry On movies.
No.
Of the 1970s. They were very famous, sort of slapstick comedy. But there was a whole series of Carry On. It's a bit like the Road 2 movies with Bob Hope. There was Carry On and you name it. It was a Carry On this and Carry On that. Sid James had a long career in those films, but I think he's started off his career working alongside Hancock. It's a great golden time. You're talking about the 1980s and the alternative comic scene becoming this big explosion of talent. But I think in Britain it was post-war, where the BBC, everything was the BBC in England back then, but the BBC were looking to somehow, the Light programme it was called, to entertain the folks, and there was a big surge of comedic talent come out of there. Yeah.
Well, definitely one of the big turning points for me, and became one of my all-time favorites, and probably still is. If you have to ask me who's your favorite comedian right away, it was Eddie Izzard. Or is Eddie Izzard.
Yeah, Eddie Izzard, yeah.
And it all came about when, this was around 2000, and HBO showed his Dressed to Kill special.
Yes.
Which wasn't his first one. I think he filmed a couple of them prior, but this is the one that they showed, and we caught that on HBO, and it just changed everything.
Yes.
And it was back, again, this was still videotape days. There was DVDs coming out, but we taped it, and it was like we had to share it with all our friends. So, we'd let so-and-so borrow the tape, and then they'd let the next person. We had to spread the word of Eddie throughout them, and it was just unbelievably good.
Very, very funny comedian. Now, I'm going to suggest to you, if you're unfamiliar with Spike Milligan, if you are with Eddie Izzard, of course, as we've just chatted about. If you then look at some of Spike Milligan's stuff and Tony Hancock stuff, you will see it in Izzard. It's that same sort of completely surreal way of looking at life. And I remember, I'm no expert on Eddie Izzard, but I remember that line, "The monkeys in the tree," Le singe dans l'arbre.
Yes.
Kept talking about, right? Just
when he's trying to learn, where he's going to use
where would I learn? Where would I use that line? How would that help me ever?
The mouse is under the chair.
That's right. How does that help me get a beer in France? It was that sort of But absolutely great comic talent. England and the States, but my experience is certainly growing up in England, but England produced some great comic talent, and a lot of it was based around that, just looking at life from a completely oblique, surreal take on life. And that's what made Pythons, all of the Pythons were like that. They had that wonderful ability to not take life seriously.
Yes.
Which in the 1960s and into the 1970s was a radical breakaway from everything that had gone before. It's like we just talked about sketch writing would have to have a start, a middle, and an end. And that breakaway, let's say the whole thing can be encompassed with what Python have done, Monty Python have done in the 70s. But it was always, you don't need to do that. There is another way of finding the comedy in something, and it's not to have. And now, when I look back on or hear some of the early comedy shows from the 1940s and 1950s, and the BBC still put a lot of those shows out on BBC 4 Extra, which again you can find online. So if you, gentle listener, if you're unfamiliar with BBC Radio, it is extremely high quality. And now with the internet, we can listen to it with ease in the States. So I think the app might be called Sounds now, but if you look for BBC Radio, we can get access to those shows. BBC has a number of stations, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 Extra, 5 Extra. BBC, so Radio 1 is music for the kids, the crazy kids. Radio 2 is music for those in their 50s. Radio 3 is classic music. Radio 4 is all talk radio. Radio 4 Extra is all the comedy shows. and drama shows that used to be on Radio 4 without 4 Extra. So they're all there. But I'm saying this because if you want to research comedy and how comedy developed in the UK, the BBC have got wonderful archives and everything is there. So if you want to hear a particular show, you can find it. 99% of the stuff there. I say it's not 100% because some of those early radio shows, like some of the early TV shows, have been wiped or the tapes have been lost. Which is why I'm always surprised. You know, we talk about Doctor Who as being a show that I really liked in the 1970s, and a number of Doctor Who shows were reputedly lost forever. The tapes were taped over, or they were lost, or blah blah blah. And then it's a little bit like finding Roman coins in England. You think there can't be any more Roman coins to find. Surely we must have found them all. Or, you know, there cannot be another sarcophagus in Egypt. They must have all been located. And then another one is found.
Yeah.
And it's the same with Doctor Who shows or Dad's Army shows or anything that we thought was forever lost in BBC radio. I think fairly recently, for reasons I'm entirely unable to explain, they tend to appear in Australia. I don't know, somebody's clearing out their attic in Australia and, oh, what's this tape? Oh, it's a lost Doctor Who episode. Who would have thought this would have been here, you know? Yeah, how did we get onto that? Not sure.
You mean we went off track? It's such a rarity.
Anyway, yes, the history of British comedy is not what we're talking about, but there's a lot of good resources out there if you're interested in.
Well, I mean, this topic, I mean, it's one of those we can barely touch the tip of the iceberg
Right,
on
right.
all that's out there and all that's been great throughout the decades. I mean, you talk about the early radio stuff, it makes you think, you know, just the Abbott and Costello Who's on First routine
Absolutely.
will go down as one of the greatest, you know, written
Yes.
pieces of all time.
There is absolutely no question, and almost all of Laurel and Hardy, almost everything that Laurel and Hardy did in terms of movies, just there is a level of whether it's comic timing or it's just natural ability that is priceless stuff. And we're not talking about literature, but this is a connection to that. There's a famous quote. Don't ask me who said it. Like, classic literature will never go out of style because it can't be bettered. When you look back at brilliant comedians, that comedy of Abbott and Costello or Laurel and Hardy or Spike Milligan or whichever great comic talent you want to pick on, it will always stand the test of time because it can't be bettered.
Yeah.
It frustrates the bejesus out of me when I'm a big fan of BBC Radio, as you've probably gathered, and I grew up with it, and I love radio. But sometimes when the BBC put what they consider to be comedy shows out, and they're typically like, I think it's 6:30 in the evening on Channel 4, on Radio 4, it's just not funny. I mean, it might be just me getting old, but I think there's a laugh track over the top of it to tell the audience when to find something amusing, and that's always, to me, the kiss of death.
Yeah.
Find this funny, we're putting a laugh track over it. Well, it's not funny. And my argument is always, look, if you can't better what has gone before, just repeat what's gone before. There's no need to put these awful shows on. Anyway, we're getting off topic, but yes, great comedy cannot be replaced because it hasn't been able to be replaced.
Yeah. I mean, it is great nowadays that there are so many outlets and there's things you can find, but there's something lost when back in the 60s, early 60s, maybe late 70s, that all the country was watching Ed Sullivan. They're watching that same performer, or they're watching Milton Berle's show.
Okay.
That yes, you were in front of the TV, but you weren't locked into a screen. But it was just the cultural thing of what you do at whatever time on that time of the week. What, 90% of the country maybe tuned into the one show, and it's something everybody shared. Yeah. And you were able to talk about it and go along for the ride. Now you say, oh, I'm watching this show or whatever, and half the people haven't heard of it or whatever. You've lost that kind of unity and enjoying the same thing sometimes.
I know exactly what you mean. And again, it was the same on the other side of the Atlantic in my childhood in England, that we knew that at 7 o'clock on a certain day this show was on, and at 9 o'clock on another day that show was on, and everyone was watching it. And unfortunately, and I think it's somewhat of a tragedy and a failing, and you just said it, the way that TV, and it's a very loose term now, TV, is structured is half of the shows that are winning awards. I mean, I'm probably a bad example for this because although I've been working in television for 20 years, I'm not really a huge fan of television. I watch it, but I'm not absolutely glued to it. But half of the shows that are winning awards, I've never heard of because I haven't got that particular streaming service.
Exactly.
If you haven't,
I can't get to it anyway.
If you haven't got Netflix, well, the show that's winning award you have never heard of, or Hulu, or Amazon Prime, or HBO. It doesn't matter. Pick your streaming service. But if you're not subscribed to that particular service, you're lost. You have no clue what it is. So those, for want of a better term, water cooler conversations that you would have
they're
the
much
next
more
day.
spread out. And
I'm sorry. I'm sure it's a great show. I've no idea what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, but something that our listeners can, and I recommend this to anyone, as we were talking about comedians, and getting back to the root of it being stand-up. When things get back to where you can, and they'll be doing it, go to your local comedy club, because I tell you, I love going to concerts and such, and we've talked about that before. But I tell you, and I was looking into something for later this year, and it's a fairly big name. Tickets start at $200, and just go up for a concert.
Yes.
But you can go to a comedy club for maybe $20 to $40.
Yeah.
And 40 is pretty. It's going to be a big name act, and you're in a nice little club, and you're maybe 10 feet away from the comedian. And I tell you, it's great value these days. We've gone the past few years and saw the two we saw, were Piff the Magic Dragon, and Drew Lynch.
Okay.
Both of them were on America's Got Talent, and here they came through on their tour. Tickets weren't that much. It was a very fun evening, and I think they were again $20 to $30 each seat, and it was very good value for what you get.
Yeah, great.
And of course, you're going to help out, some of the rising comedians too. And it's probably it's something I recommend getting back to once the comedy clubs are able to, get going again.
Well, you mentioned earlier on that I'm a fan of Rick Mayall. Dear old Rick Mayall. I wish he was still with us, but there we go. Many years ago in Loughborough, a friend of mine invited me to join him at Loughborough Town Hall. Well, Loughborough is a small town anyway, at least it was back then. The university may have grown quite a lot, but the town centre hasn't grown very much. But Loughborough Town Hall was a very small venue, and Rick Mayall was playing in Loughborough Town Hall, and my friend asked me to go along with him, and I went. It was a great evening. But the reason it was a great evening was A, I love his comedy, but B, the reason, it was a big name back then, and he was playing an incredibly small venue in an almost unknown town. But the reason he was doing that, he was working on his act, so he was rehearsing and trying out material on a small audience to see what was working and what wasn't working. And I was fascinated, loved to see him anyway. His anarchic sense of humour is fantastic, but at some point he was reading notes, then he'd stop and go back and try something else. But just that interaction, when he would stop and he wasn't sure where he was going with a particular sketch, and he'd read his notes, and then someone in the audience would stop heckling him, just, well, what are you doing reading your notes, Rick? But his ability to fire back instantly those acidic comments that would kill the heckler's dead and get the rest of the audience with him instantly on his side again it's a remarkable talent that, again, back to where we started this, you either have that brilliant natural comic ability or you don't.
Oh yeah.
It's not the same as reading a script. Some great actors can be funny, but they're not comedians. There's an entirely different genre of ability, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that's again how I think Rickles was. When we get back to him, there was one time that Dennis Miller had a show 20 years ago or something like that, and he came on as the guest, and Dennis started talking, and Rickles said one word, and Dennis fell out of his chair laughing so hard. And I think because he's just that bam, bam, and can do it.
Yeah.
So.
Yes, it's a natural thing. It's there or it's not there, but I don't think you can ever you can't develop that. You can be a funny actor, but you're not a naturally funny comedian. It is an odd industry, how folks feel attracted to that industry. I mean, for a first-time comedian, I always think it's an odd thing, quite frankly, Kevin, when folks are asked what do they do for a living, and they say I'm a comedian, because it's almost like you can't you can't give yourself the title of comedian. You have to win it. You have to
Yeah.
earn it, right? You can't say to the camera, "I am funny. I am a comedian." It doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, you have to prove your worth on stage. But that's another thing, I guess. But that idea that for the first time, a young unknown comic, keen to be a comedian, will take to the stage and read material, it must be terrifying. When nobody knows you, nobody's got any idea of your personality. So unlike the Rick Mel thing we just talked about, where the audience already knows that Rick Mel character, or Brickle's character, whatever it would be, you're on side with them because you know who he is to start with. But an unknown comedian, first time on stage, has got nothing to draw from.
Yeah.
No one in the audience is going to support who he is or she is, because we've never heard of you in any way. You've got to work that audience with your material. And I take my hat off absolutely to anybody that wants to do that for a living and can make a success out of it. It's a brilliant thing. Make the ability to make people laugh is a fantastic skill, and it's to be, in my opinion, it's to be applauded and supported all the time.
Well, I think on the opposite side, as a viewer and listener of their comedy, you never know what's going to strike you funny sometimes until it does.
Yes.
You never know what's going to send you right over the edge, and you just can't stop laughing.
Yeah, it is. It's a very yes, you're right. It's very mysterious what folks find amusing, and how it works. Yeah, those anarchic moments in alternative comedy over in England, or I don't know. Sometimes it's just a look to camera. It's just that odd look, isn't it? That's all it takes, But that one look to camera, and again, breaking what actors call the fourth wall, the invisible wall between what's happening on stage and the audience. Well, of course, with stand-up comic, that's happening all the time. But in a movie, that very rarely happens until occasionally someone looks to camera. It doesn't happen very often. But when they break that fourth wall and that look, it's a wonderful thing. Curiously enough, Burt Reynolds does exactly that, breaks the fourth wall in Smokey the Bandit one time. I don't know if you can remember this, when he's hiding from the cop, he had a cop chase.
He's jumped behind the building.
It's exactly
at night.
that, yes. He's chucked the Trans Am around the back of the building, and then he just looks to camera and smiles.
Yeah.
Just that one time.
And he just turns and drives away.
And it's a brilliant, it only happens that one time, and it's a brilliant moment in the movie.
Well, speaking of that made me think of this too. When they were filming Trading Places with Eddie Murphy,
right?
The part where the Dukes are explaining commodities to him.
Yeah. And
the director told him when they said, bacon, like you'd find in a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich. And they told him to just look at the camera. And at the time he said, I don't understand why that's funny. And to this day, it's one of the best moments because he looks like, really? And it's become like one of the best parts of the whole movie.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to pinpoint how comic timing works, or comedy in general works. It either works or it doesn't, but boy, if you've got it, you've really gotten. If you haven't got it, I don't think it's something that you can ever really learn. Again, you can be a good actor and copy it and read script, but that natural comic ability is something very, very precious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of timing, hopefully we've entertained today.
Hey, how about that?
If we've made them laugh, that's even better.
How about that for a segue? Look at that. Yes, my clock says 39 minutes, so we better call it a day.
I think so.
And drop the curtain on this. Well, that was great fun.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, like I say,
I love every conversation we have, but I always love the contrast between what's happening in the States and over in England, and how things develop and advance. And I always think, I know we've got to get off air here, but I always think it's wonderful we always have to accept and acknowledge that we got here from there. And although it's very easy to look back on some early comedy and say it was just awful, how did we ever find that funny? Well, we changed it because it wasn't funny. We moved forward, we made advances, and we got here to the comedy that we do like because of the comedy we didn't like.
Yep.
We advanced to here from where we got here from there, and that's the same with everything. Yeah, we better go. Gentle listener, join us again on another episode of Magic and the Other Guy. Bye for now.
we'll be back.